Moose Lake UFO sighting, 4 continuous days of UFOs, and they were chased by military jets. This is part 2. The first part was just uploaded a few minutes ago, and you'll see that UFO sighting incident at Moose Lake, 4 continuous days of UFOs. And this is the second part of this. The incident at Moose Lake, part 2. This is by J. O'Connell on Three Rivers News. And there was a news clipping in February 10th, 1963, Visalia, California. A letter saying from 1951 to 59, he says, I served the National Park Service as a ranger in Ash Mountain entrance to the Sequoia National Park, and my tour of duty was from 12 p.m. midnight from May to October, and from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. during the other months of the year. Now, the flying saucer era. In the early 1960s, local UFO unidentified flying object expert Carl Bueller wrote a letter to a ranching couple in Strathmore, California. In it, he outlined his background as a ranger in Sequoia National Park during the 1950s, and noted his experience as a member of the Ground Observer Corps. That's a group charged with sighting and tracking unknown aircraft, prompted no doubt by the Cold War paranoia of the era. But the real purpose of Bueller's letter to Oscar and Kitty Knight was to follow up on something they had told him, and to provide background and supporting evidence to their remarkable story. Bueller told the couple how a cigar-shaped air vehicle appeared 4 days in succession and maneuvered around Morro Rock, and that, quote, the park superintendent phoned the Fresno National Guard, Air Force, and jets were scrambled, end quote. He further pointed out how this episode was later encountered in Major Donald Kehoe's book, The Flying Saucer Conspiracy. Bueller maintained this was around the time of, quote, the experience you have related to me, end quote, suggesting they had witnessed, quote, the mothership of a number of smaller UFOs, flying saucers that were sighted many times by hundreds of persons in the park. And I believe these to be of extraterrestrial origin, he wrote, end quote. This is amazing. What had Oscar and his wife Kitty told Carl Bueller? Could their story have been any more fantastic than what Carl and many others were already claiming had happened in the skies above Sequoia? We're talking about the 4 consecutive days of UFO encounters, motherships and their little smaller ships around the mothership. Now, to find out, we turn to research conducted by another so-called UFO expert, one who was responsible as anyone for the flying saucer craze of that era. It can be said that the modern age of flying saucers began in 1947, when civilian pilot and fire extinguisher salesman Kenneth Arnold, this is a man holding a picture of the UFO, Kenneth Arnold saw several disc-shaped objects in the skies near Mount Rainier in Washington. Arnold described the movement of these objects as like saucers skipping across the water. Saucers skipping across the water. Newspapers reported Arnold's remarkable experience with the headline, quote, supersonic flying saucers sighted by Idaho pilot, end quote. The term stuck. An era was born. Flying saucers. With his background in aviation and the notoriety that followed his sightings, Arnold became something of an authority on these unidentified flying objects that he himself had helped to label. From the late 1940s to the early 1960s, he traveled the western United States investigating reports of such phenomena. He did this at his own personal expense, evidence of his near obsession with the subject. Perhaps he sought to explain his own experience and to provide proof through sightings by others that he himself was not crazy. Oscar Knight's tale. Oscar Knight, upon meeting with Kenneth Arnold, told the researcher that he and his wife were well-liked and responsible citizens, quote-unquote, who were only now telling the story because, quote, people have the right to know the facts and make their own interpretation, end quote. The story he told was a whopper. On a summer excursion, the Knights, along with another couple, Mr. and Mrs. Ken Halliday, set up camp at Wolverton Meadow. Oscar related how, while the women remained at the campsite, the menfolk adjusted their packs, checked out their fishing equipment, and then made their way into the back country. He and Halliday had the trail all to themselves until, after pausing near Panther Gap to admire the majestic view of the Great Western Divide, they were startled to see, quote, a finely dressed gentleman coming down the trail, end quote. Okay? A finely dressed gentleman coming down the trail. What the heck does that mean? I mean, when you're going hiking, or fishing or whatever, you're not finely dressed on the top of a mountain. But anyway, let's go on to this. Oscar then explained to the intrepid flying saucer investigator how, quote, the stranger was not dressed for this wild woodland setting, end quote. He wore low-topped Oxfords, a neatly pressed shirt, and an old-fashioned wraparound dress tie. He didn't have a coat or hat or even a pack to carry food and water. Quote, his eyes were different from any I had ever seen. They were a clear, transparent brown that one looked into with depth, not opaque like ours, end quote. Okay? His eyes were different from any I had ever seen. They were a clear, transparent brown that one looked into with depth, not opaque like ours. Oscar commented it was like he was a, quote, ghost from the 19th century, end quote, who appeared out of nowhere. According to Oscar, this unusual gentleman then started asking questions in a very odd manner. Quote, there was courtesy in his well-modulated voice, his clipped and precise phrasing of words, cutting each word separately as he would ask, gentlemen, where are you going? Gentlemen, how high is that peak? It was as if he had recently learned our language. Oscar noted that following this odd trailside encounter, he and Halliday hiked on, but their minds were, quote, searching for answers as to whom our meeting had been with, end quote. Little did they know that a deeper mystery would come to light. Blobs of Light. Their hike that day took them to the north rim of rugged Buck Creek Canyon, a precipice just south of Moose Lake. It was there they finally laid down their packs as the shadows were creeping into the warm of night's approach. In view to the east, far across the deep chasm, was the towering Triple Divide Peak, catching the last dying glow of daylight, and before long, darkness. Quote, suddenly, 5 or 6 moving blobs of light rose, and near these a long string of softly glowing lights, Oscar recounted. He said, they appeared as if they were coming from some sort of portholes. The smaller lights came to rest on the big rock surface, while the huge object, which I estimated to be about 1/4 of a mile long, began to very slowly rise up to the point up the shoulder of the peak, and there it stopped, end quote. They judged the lights to be about a mile distant. When they eventually climbed into their sleeping bags, the lights were still in the canyon, but had not further approached, so they were finally able to go to sleep, at an utter loss for words, wondering what they had seen. The next morning, they saw no evidence of anything strange in the region below them. They didn't catch any fish on that trip, but little did they care. All they could think about was the appearance of the oddly dressed gentleman and the phosphorus blobs of light. On their way back down the trail to rejoin their wives at Wolverton Meadow, the story took an even stranger turn. Comes a horseman. Quote, on our way back, our astonishment could not have been greater. For whom were we to see in almost the same spot? Oh my goodness. I would be jumping out of my skin. I don't even know how these men slept that night after what was going on. They saw this weird gentleman It sounds like Starman with Jeff Bridges. You'll find it on YouTube. Starman. You have to see that. This UFO comes crashing. And this man comes and takes the form of another man who had, passed away. And anyway, the woman of that passed away man falls in love with the Starman, Jeff Bridges. And anyway, it sounds like this. And I would not be able to sleep that night, with these motherships and orbs hovering in the valley below. I mean, that's ridiculous. How could you sleep? Anyway, they said, on our way back, our astonishment could not have been greater, for whom were we to see in almost the same spot but our genial friend coming up the trail, this time on a horse, end quote. Oscar recounted the conversation that ensued. He and Halliday asked the stranger if he had climbed Alta Peak. He replied in this odd clipper manner, "Yes, gentlemen, I climbed it yesterday," he said, end quote. They also took notice of the apparently awkward, though gentle manner the stranger had with his horse. Oscar then dropped a bombshell in recounting his tale. He noted that when asked his name, the mysterious stranger replied, "You can call me Arthur." Oscar then claimed that before he could even then ask where he was from, he said, "I received an impression in my mind that as if by thought transference, that he was from the planet we knew as Venus." Venus again. I mean, what's with this Venus? When I asked him what he was doing there, he said that he and his friends often visit this canyon, as well as other wilderness spots on Earth. Quote, "The seclusion of this area makes it an ideal place," end quote. No kidding. What did I tell you? Now, at this point, one can imagine an ideal place to do what? To land there? Anyway, at this point, one can imagine even flying saucer expert Kenneth Arnold becoming a bit skeptical of the story. He told Oscar, "I really want to believe you. If only I could speak to a Venusian face to face, then I too would be convinced of what you have told me this day," end quote. I think we can all share that sentiment. The story is beyond fanciful. Perhaps Oscar really did encounter an oddly dressed, peculiar gentleman on the trail to Moose Lake. Any experienced hiker knows that it's not uncommon to meet odd people along the trail. And we can certainly imagine that Oscar and his fishing companion really did see strange, unexplainable lights emanating from deep in the high country canyon. After all, similar lights had only recently made headlines. Even the park superintendent was among those who had witnessed this phenomenon. Most recently, the friend who first sent me the account of the story himself recalled back about 15 years back, quote, "sitting on our thermarest chairs looking out towards Black Keween and the Kewee Range, when all of a sudden the entire range was lit up in red for about 5 seconds. It was stunning," end quote. So seeing strange lights in Sequoia's backcountry is not unprecedented. It happened in the 1950s, and it happens these days as well. But being told telepathically that this stranger is from Venus, that part I just don't buy. But maybe, just maybe, this extraterrestrial tourist said telepathically Venus because he didn't want to try to explain where Proxima Centauri b or some such distant planet was located. And this is just one of the so many stories of high strangeness to be told in future installments of all these things. Stories might be hard to believe, but impossible to ignore. This is on Three Rivers News and by Jay O'Connell, and I'll leave a link below for you for this. If you'd like to join me on my Patreon account, you will hear content not covered by mainstream media. These riveting stories will be based on my research, and I will state my opinions and give my personal insight on diverse and controversial subjects and world events not covered by mainstream media, and not supported by YouTube guidelines. So whatever I have on my Patreon, most of those will not be on my YouTube channel. Please consider becoming a member today. More of the most significant and important videos will be on my Patreon channel. Your support helps me to continue my research and keeps this YouTube channel alive. And we depend on your support, your generous charity, because we help economically challenged families here in Athens, Greece, in Kapota, and we also help the young generation with university tuition and the community around our church. Thank you.